All right, so I will officially open our event by expressing my gratitude that most of us are gathered virtually this evening on the shared unceded territories of the Lilwat people, known in their language as Lilwa'ul, and of the Squamish people, known in their language as Squamish. We're so lucky to live, work, play, read, write on these territories. If you are joining from elsewhere, we would love to know. You're welcome to drop a little comment in the chat box, and welcome from wherever you're joining us from. I am Jeanette Bruce. Some of you know me, not all of you know me, but I'm the program coordinator at Whistler Public Library, and I have the distinct pleasure of hosting Gary Geddes tonight. Bronwyn says, hello from the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh territories. Yes, and that's where Gary is as well. So Gary has edited and written more than 50 books of poetry, fiction, drama, nonfiction, criticism, translation, and anthologies, and has been the recipient of at least a dozen literary awards, including the Commonwealth Poetry Prize, the National Magazine Gold Award, the Lieutenant Governor's Award for Literary Excellence, and the Gabriela Mistral Prize from the government of Chile. But we are here to speak about Gary's most recent book, The Ventriloquist. And yes, you can see I have the library's copy. I promise I'll return it tomorrow now that I've finished reading it. But it's a real pleasure to have this book added to our collection. I thoroughly enjoyed reading this. As Stella said before we started recording, it's not an easy read, but it's very rewarding. So I would also just like to acknowledge that we received support from the League of Canadian Poets for this event. So thank you to the League of Canadian Poets. And in terms of housekeeping, you're welcome to submit questions through the chat box, or when we get to that point of the evening, you can unmute yourself and ask Gary a question. You'll know when that time comes. But right now, I am going to turn it over to Gary. Hello.
Hi, Jeanette. Hi, everybody. It's great to be here. I'm so glad you've taken some time out to share some poetry with me. I've been writing for a lot of years, and I've done 50 books of one sort and another, and some of them inevitably go out of print. And I tend to forget them, and readers may well forget them too. But I have a friend who is the former president of Oxford University Press. His name is David Stover. When he retired from Oxford, he started a small literary press in Ontario called Rocks Mills Press. And it's a very fine press, and I had recommended him to a number of my friends whose books are being published there. But I got a surprise one day from David. He wrote and said, have you got any of your work that's out of print that you would like me to bring back into the light of day? And I was shocked, but when I began to think about it, I realized that 4 of my favorite and longest poems, narrative poems, had been out of print for some time. And this was an opportunity not to exploit David's generosity by saying, yes, would you like to publish all 4 of them in separate copies? I said, why don't we put the 4 of them in a single book called The Ventriloquist? And he was really keen and precipitated this project in a matter of 6 or 8 months. It was quite amazing. Usually you have to wait a few years to get a book out. So I'm very grateful to David for doing that. And so the question might come to mind, why call it The Ventriloquist? Well, one of my graduate students years ago was doing research into poetry, and she came upon a phrase called the ventriloquist of history, or ventriloquism of history. And I was so shocked by this because it seemed to depict exactly how these narrative poems had come into being. It almost seemed as if there were disembodied voices out there floating through the ether. They'd been silenced by turmoil or time, and they were looking for a sucker to tell their stories. And I was the sucker. Now, it's a pretty exciting thing when this happens, when these voices take you by the throat but it's also pretty scary because it can take 5 to 10 years of your life. I'll talk a little bit about that later. And it can require you, if you want to really get into the persona of the characters you're talking about, it can take you to places that are pretty scary in deep down in your own self, where you just as soon not go. Yeats had a phrase that characterizes where that is. He said, "I must go down where all the ladders start, in the foul rag and bone shop of the heart." It's a place that any good writer has to visit if they're going to do things properly, but it's not always an easy thing to do. And when I look back at the memories of the 4 poems in this book, I realized that it sure did take me to some dark places. And it will take the reader to some of those places as well. But I like Dylan Thomas's notion that there's a therapeutic element in poetry, and it means that it's really not just a call to action, but it's a healing source. And for me, I write about things that trouble me so much that I have to make some kind of artistic sense out of them. And that's what happened with these poems. And so if the ventriloquism of history is how these things have come to pass, what does that make me? The ventriloquist or the dummy? So you could ask my wife and guess what she might say. Anyway, I'm going to start with a poem that's not in the ventriloquist. It's a poem about the killings at Kent State University. It's one of the poems I'm best known for. And since it is also based very specifically on the Vietnam War, I'm going to start with that. And it came about in an odd way. I was protesting the escalation of the Vietnam War into Cambodia outside the Canadian consulate or American consulate in Toronto. And somebody tapped me on the shoulder and said, "Did you hear what happened in Kent State this morning?" And when he told me that the Ohio National Guard had fired 211 rounds of assault weapon ammunition into an unarmed crowd, killing 4 and wounding 9 others, I just felt like the Grand Canyon had opened up between my parents and my generation. And I had this terrible urge that I should write something about it. But for 6 years, I kept a file folder, and it was full of diatribes against American foreign policy. And they were all rubbish. And then I went into a little bookstore in Edmonton called the Wee Book Inn, and I found a book in the political science section, a small red paperback with the price of $1 on it. And it was called The Killings at Kent State. And it was by that absolutely wonderful American journalist called I.F. Stone, who was so famous that even his enemies used to read the I.F. Stone's Weekly to see where things stood. So I paid that money and went home and started reading the book. And I learned about the 4 victims. And one of them, so the little details about this young woman struck me so powerfully, I knew I could chuck those other notes and start in from scratch. For one thing, she was a speech therapy student. She was tidy. She liked to roller skate, and she was not particularly political. So here it is. It's called Sandra Lee Scheuer, killed by the Ohio National Guard, May 4th, 1970. You might have met her on a Saturday night, cutting precise circles clockwise at the Moonglow roller rink, or walking with quick step between the campus and a green 2-story house, where the room was always tidy, the bed made, the books in confraternity on the shelves. She did not throw stones, major in philosophy, or set fire to buildings, though acquaintances say she hated war, had heard of Cambodia. In truth, she wore a modicum of makeup, a brassiere, and could no doubt more easily have married a guardsman than cursed or put a flower in his rifle barrel. While the armories burned, she studied, bent low over notes, speech therapy books, pages open at sections on impairment, physiology. And while they milled and shouted on the commons, she helped a boy named Billy with his lisp. Hiss, Billy, like a snake. That's it, tongue well back behind your teeth. Buzz, Billy, like a bee. Feel the air vibrating in my windpipe as I breathe. As she walked in sunlight through the parking lot at noon, feeling the world a passing lovely place, a young guardsman who had his sights on her was going down on one knee as if he might propose. His declaration, unmistakable, articulate, flowered within her, passed through her neck, severed her trachea, taking her breath away. Now who will burn the midnight oil for Billy, ensure the perilous freedom of his speech? And who will see her skating at the Moonglow roller rink, the 8 small wooden wheels, making their countless revolutions on the floor? That was an interesting learning experience for me. After 6 years of trying to use my anger to produce something, I had to let it all go. And I ended up writing this simple elegy for Sandra Lee, and to some lesser degree to the young soldier who knew he had killed her and would live for the rest of his life with that memory. So, you know, I love working in shorter pieces like that, but somehow when you're working on a major narrative, you need a broader canvas. So I started to work on narrative poems, and I owe it to my friend Gus Heidemann, who used to come into our shared office at the University of Toronto and look rather frightfully at his desk, hoping that there wasn't another one of my bad poems on it that he would be expected to comment on. And this day he came in and he didn't even bother looking at his desk because he knew where fate had him for that day. He said, "Gary, William Blake found a universe in a grain of sand, but you're not going to find it in your belly button. So stop contemplating it." And I snuck out of the office and went home and had a beer and turned on the television. And there was news coverage of the first major assassination event in the United States in recent years. It was at the University of Texas. And it was a man named Charles Whitman who had gone into the tower fully armed with all sorts of weapons and ammunition and had opened fire on the students. And I was so moved by this description that I thought, I need to write about that event. And I thought, this is what Gus Heidemann was trying to get me to do, to stop thinking about myself. So I assumed the persona of Charles Whitman and wrote a poem about it. And it was the first thing I'd ever written, I think, that had any merit. And it was the beginning of a long career of writing through other personas than my own. So I have to thank Gus Heidemann for his rude and belated comment about my exploiting him. Anyway, the first narrative poem that came out of that came also, it was one of these voices that from the past that began to speak to me. I decided I wanted to be an actor. I'm not sure why. I think it was because my friend Jeremy Hole was a wonderful actor, and I was hoping to imitate him. And I'd also played Robin Hood in a grade 6 play, and thought, yeah, this is the thing for me. So I went with Jeremy to the audition at the University of Toronto. It was a Pinter and a Beckett play. Well, Jeremy got a role, and I was invited to sell tickets over the phone. It was not what I'd wanted, and it was depressing. So, but I took it with good grace. I managed to fake a smile and said, "Sure, I'll do that." I went home and I I had this terrible urge to write something that, and I looked on my shelves and I picked out a little book from my undergraduate days at UBC. It was called Weather. It was a Geography 101 textbook, and it had all those wonderful words like lateral moraines, cumulonimbus clouds, stratocumulonimbus clouds, things you could throw into a cocktail party. And anyway, I scrolled through it, and one of the illustrations in this little textbook was a picture of a Spanish galleon with a horse suspended in the air, leaping off the ship. Underneath it said horse latitudes, that area in the Atlantic where the Spanish ships were becalmed and ran out of water and had to throw their horses overboard. Well, I just sat down, started scribbling like crazy, and produced a number of hysterical pages that looked as if they might have some potential to actually be a poem. And this is what happened the next night. I was supposed to be selling tickets. I put the phone off the hook and I started to write. And I realized that to make those hysterical notes that I had written the night before work, I needed someone who was so close to the killing of those horses that he could barely speak about it. So are you hearing me all right? Okay, here it is. It's called Letter of the Master of Horse. I was signed on the king's authority as master of horse. 3 days, I remember quite clearly, 3 days after we parted. I did not really believe it. It seemed so much the unrolling of an incredible dream. Bright plumes, scarlet tunics, glint of sunlight on armor, 50 of the king's best horses, strong, high-spirited, rearing to the blast of trumpets, galloping down the long avenida to the waiting ships. And me, your gangling brother, permitted to ride with cavalry. Laughter, children singing in the market, women dancing, throwing flowers, the whole street covered with flowers. In the Plaza del Sol, a blind beggar kissed my eyes. I hadn't expected the softness of his fingers moving upon my face. A bad beginning. The animals knew, hesitated at the ramps, backed off, finally had to be blindfolded and beaten aboard. The sailors grumbled for days, as if we had brought on board a cargo of women. But the sea smiled as we lost our escort of gulls, smiled as we lost our escort, and I have seen such smiles on the faces of hooras in Barcelona. For months now, an unwelcome guest in my own body. I squat by the fire in a silence broken only by the tireless grinding of insects. I've taken to drawing your face in the brown earth at my feet. The ears are never quite right. You are waving. Your tears are a river that rushes beside me. I lie for days in the sea, drier than the rivers of the desert of the Moors. Your tears are sucked into the parched throat of the sky. I'm watched daily. The ship's carpenter is at work nearby within the stockade, fashioning a harness for me, a wooden collar. He is a fool who takes no pride in his work, yet the chips lie about his feet, beautiful as yellow petals. Days melt in the hot sun, flow together. An order is given to jettison the horses. It sweeps like a breeze over parched black faces. I am not consulted. The Ortega comes to me later when it is over and says, God knows, there are men I'd have worried less to lose. The sailors are relieved, fall to it with abandon. The first horse is blindfolded and led to the gunwales, struck so hard it leaps skyward in an arc, its great body etched against the sun. I remember thinking how graceless it looked, out of its element, legs braced and stiffened for the plunge. They drink long draughts, muzzles submerged to the eyes, set out like spokes in all directions. The salt does its work. First scream, proud head thrown back, nostrils flared, flesh tight over teeth and gums, yellow teeth, bloody gums, the spasms, heaving bodies, turning. I am the center of this churning circumference, the wretch beside me, fingers knotted to the gunwales. They plunge toward the ship, hooves crashing on the planked hull, soft muzzles ripped and bleeding on splintered wood and barnacles. The ensign's mare struggles half out of the water on the backs of two hapless animals. When the affair ended, the sea was littered with bodies, smooth, bloated carcasses. Neither pike pole nor ship's boats could keep them off. Sailors who never missed a meal retched violently in the hot sun. Only the silent industry of sharks could give them rest. What is the shape of freedom, after all? Did I come here to be devoured by insects or maddened by screams in the night? Ortega, when we found him, pinned and swinging in his bones, jawbone pinned and singing in the wind, God's lieutenant, more eloquent in death. Sooner or later, hope evaporates. Joy itself is seasonal. The others, they are Spaniards, no more and no less, and burn with a lust that sends them tilting at the sun itself. Ortega, listen, the horses. Where are the sun's horses to pull his chariot from the sea, end this conspiracy of dark? The nights are long, the cold, a maggot boarding in my flesh. I hear them moving, barely perceptible, faint as the roar of insects, gathering to thunder across the hidden valleys of the sea, crash of hooves upon my door, hot, quick breath upon my face. My eyes, he kissed my eyes, the softness of his fingers moving. Forgive me, I did not mean this to be my final offering. Sometimes the need to forgive, be forgiven, makes the heart a pilgrim. I'm no traveler, my Christopher, faceless with rubbing in the voyage out, the voyage into exile. Islanded in our separate selves, words are too frail a bridge. I see you in the morning running to meet me down the mountainside, your face transfigured with happiness. Wait for me, my sister, where wind rubs bare the cliff face, where we rode to watch the passing ships at daybreak and saw them burn golden from masthead down to waterline. I will come soon. As I was reading that last line, island in our separate selves, words are too frail a bridge, it just struck a COVID note for me, the long silence. That's why it's so great to have a chance to share some poems with you folks, because it has been a long silence for me. There were moments during the COVID when, having been used to doing lectures and readings and talks about books, I was without all of that and hadn't realized what an impact that was and how important it was in my life. And there was one day I could hardly put a sentence together. And I was only rescued from this growing muteness by a request from Mark Vesey at Green College at UBC, who said, Gary, how'd you like, I know you've written this new play about Trotsky and I'm really excited about it. How would you like to share a Zoom talk with Colleen Murphy, who is our playwright in residence at Green College? And so Reluctantly and with a great deal of trepidation, I accepted Mark's offer, and that began to break the silence. So here I am, Zooming, still Zooming. So maybe we'll pause for a moment and ask Jeanette if she has a question or two to throw into the pot.
Certainly. Thank you, Gary. Thanks for those readings, especially, I mean, I had read the Master of Horses one in your book, but hearing it read aloud was really powerful. I do have some questions for you. And I guess we can start with kind of a softball, which addresses I guess, the elephant in the room, which is, why have you written so much about war?
Yeah, it's a question I asked myself when I was told by David that he would publish some of my work, and I gathered the four pieces together. I thought, you know, these pieces mean a lot to me, but why am I still obsessed with the issue of war? And so I began to think about that. And I was born in 1940. I grew up in a household that was very worried about the war in Vancouver. Two of our relatives had been bombed in their house and died in Bournemouth, the little coastal city in England. The German planes returning had a bomb or two left, and one of them was gifted to their house. So that was part of the anxiety in the household. And my Vancouver uncle, Tom Turner, who used to run Turner's boats at Whitecliff after the war, he was reported missing in action when his Lancaster bomber was shot down over Hamburg. And, you know, from there, I went to school in Vancouver, was asked in a few years after the war to crawl under my desk because we were doing nuclear air raid exercises, as if that was going to save any of us if a bomb hit Vancouver. And then I got to UBC and was exposed to all the great novels, Slaughterhouse-Five, Generals Die in Bed by William Harrison, Yale Harrison, Vancouver, Canadian writer. And then the poets like Wilfred Owen and Randall Jarrell. The last line of Jarrell's poem, called "The Death of the Turret Gunner," is, "When I died, they washed me out of the turret with a hose." And none of these writers that I mentioned or others that I read ever glorified or romanticized war. And I could sympathize with that because it had been such a powerful influence on me growing up. And we were living in the Cold War at the time when nuclear weapons seemed a possibility, a good possibility. So I decided I wanted to contribute my own 2 cents worth on this subject, and not realizing it would be a lifetime doing that. Fortunately, there were other things that I wrote about too, but that was one of them.
And I wonder, Gary, these days, are you compelled to write about other types of civil unrest, like, you know, the climate crisis or the pandemic? Are those things inspiring you at all, or are you still sort of focused on themes that you've always gravitated towards?
No, fortunately, about 15 years ago, I began to write some nonfiction, and I was very interested in the question of pre-Columbian Asian contact. And I knew the story of a Chinese monk that was recorded in the Liang Dynasty records, that this monk named Hui Shen had sailed to the Americas in 458 AD, 1,000 years before Columbus. And a lot of people considered that just a legend with no reliability to it. And I used to pick up Japanese fishing floats off the beaches in Vancouver and on the coast. It meant that the Kuroshio current would bring these things across. And if the current would bring them across, it would be unlikely that no Chinese or Japanese boats didn't arrive by accident, never mind by intentionally. So I talked a publisher into giving me money to do that book, and it's called The Kingdom of 10,000 Things. This was followed by another nonfiction book, which took me to Africa to do human rights interviews with victims of genocide and former child soldiers. It was called Drink the Bitter Root, A Search for Justice and Healing in Africa. And then I came back, I was trying to work on that book, and my daughter Bronwyn, who is watching this at the moment, invited me to go with her to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission hearings in Victoria. And it was very powerful. I didn't know that that day would determine what I'd be doing for the next 6 or 7 years. We heard Joan Morris tell the audience that her mother had been taken in perfect health to the Nanaimo Indian Hospital, segregated hospital, at age 18. And she wasn't released till she was 35. 17 years in that hospital, and she came out a physical and emotional wreck. So at lunch, we met Joan, and she talked to Bronwyn about working for Indian Affairs at that time, and she asked me what I did. I made the mistake of telling her I was a writer. Her eyes grew large, and she just glommed in on me. She said, "Gary, you have to tell this story." And I didn't know what to say. Well, the short version of a long story is that she bullied me into it, and I'm so grateful to her for doing that. I came to call her she who must be obeyed. So I set off interviewing elders all across the country to see what their experiences were in the healthcare system and how they'd been neglected by the Canadian government in so many areas, and produced a book after 4 or 5 years called Medicine Unbundled, A Journey Through the Minefields of Indigenous Healthcare. So although those books are not about war, they do have a lot of emotional stuff in common. And they're basically, I think of myself as an engaged writer, somebody who's alert to what's going on in the world and willing to try to write about it and make some sort of personal sense out of it. And hopefully some sense that other people might find in it as well.
So would you say that working on compiling the Ventriloquist was a return to your favorite form? Would you say poetry is still your preferred way to write, or are you sort of equally, do you enjoy the different formats in different ways? What do you have a preference?
You know, I love poetry best of all. I chose to write those books in a form that would allow me to cover more terrain. I couldn't imagine how they would work as poems. And there just seemed to be so many people to talk to whose voices needed to be there, not just my voice, but their voices, that I started using tape recorders and making notes. And I found that it was harder to write nonfiction, and that when I'd finished it, I would often look at the lines and think, you know, there's a lot of information here and a lot of passion, but where's the music? Where's the music? And I had to acknowledge after a number of years that there wasn't enough music happening in nonfiction for me to continue. This is not to say that if I hadn't been grabbed by another subject right after Medicine Unbundled, I wouldn't have been launched into that. But it took me a while to convince the poetic muse to forgive me for my 10-year dalliance with prose. And so she made me scrabble for every drop of, you know, what might have been gold in the sand was more likely to be iron pyrites or fool's gold. But even that took a lot of effort to get forgiven for my infidelities with prose. So it was really exciting to get back to start writing some poems again. So
now
maybe
you,
yeah,
oh, go ahead. I was going to say, well, you said that writing nonfiction is harder, or it involves so much information, but I have to imagine that this book involved a lot of research as well, in order to embody the different voices that you captured in this book.
Well, excuse me while I make some rattling noises here. Yeah, it did require a lot of research. The comment I made earlier about the Hong Kong poems taking me 9 years was quite accurate. I started interviewing veterans, and I put a little sign on my door at the University of Alberta and said, "Gone fishing for 2 weeks." And I flew to Hong Kong and spent 2 weeks crawling on my belly through old battlegrounds from the World War, when the Canadian Winnipeg Grenadiers and Royal Rifles were there. And I read copies of the South China Morning Post and the Hong Kong News when the Japanese were editing and publishing those. And then I came back and I interviewed countless veterans, survivors. 1,975 men were sent as a symbolic gesture to Hong Kong. Mackenzie King and the Brits knew they didn't have a chance if the Japanese invaded. So they were basically thrown away as a kind of symbolic gesture. Many died in the battle, and the rest were slave labor for 3.5 years. Anyway, I'm going to read you a few little poems out of this Hong Kong sequence. And the first 2 or 3, well, I guess the first one will be by a man named Henderson. I tried to use the interviews, and some of them were recorded, 90 hours of taped interviews in the Museum of Man and Nature in Winnipeg. And I tried to use the materials as closely as I could to what was being said and what I imagined was being felt during those times. So this is the couple of poems about the final battles in the Battle of Hong Kong. I did most of my fighting in Repulse Bay in a hotel half full of civilians. We took up positions in a plush suite on the 2nd floor. One of the men sat in an armchair, scanning hills out back with binoculars. When he spotted movement, I'd swing into the window and fire, then drop back. Suddenly there was this woman in the doorway saying, "My dog, I'm looking for water for my dog." We pulled her down out of the line of fire and gave the dog water, radiator water we used for tea. Later, when the Japanese were 2 football fields away and their planes were dive bombing the barracks, I thought of that woman and her parting comment, "If he bothers you by barking, shoot him." This is actually the last scene of the war, just before the surrender on Christmas Day, 1941. And this is the poem I'm attributing to a vet called Sullivan. There's a strange hush at St. Stephen's as we wait for them to storm the college. Nurses drift like butterflies among the injured, offering a word, a touch, a cigarette. When the enemy bursts through the door, I'm lying on a cot at the far end of the corridor, my head bandaged, my leg supported in a sling. 2 soldiers proceed to bayonet the sick and wounded in their beds to a chorus of screams and protests. A nurse throws herself on top of one of our boys to protect him. It might have been the kid from Queens, and they are both killed by a single thrust of the bayonet. I suppose they were sweethearts. Pinned at last, she does not struggle. Her hands open and close once like tiny wings, and the dark stain on her white starched uniform spreads like a chrysanthemum, a blood-red sun. I cut the cord supporting my leg, slip on the nearest smock, and stand foolishly at attention, making the salute. My right finger brushes the damp cotton of the bandage. Later, The butchers are shot by their own officers. One apparently had lost a brother in the final assault. Now, to write this long poem, I had to do various kinds of writing, and a line from T.S. Eliot always struck a chord for me. It was his comment that if you want to write a serious long poem, you have to be able to be a master of the prose connective. And I didn't really know what that meant until I started writing this book. But if you're writing a narrative poem, you can't burn like in intense white heat on every line and every page. You have to be able to vary the emotional tempo of the thing. And so that's what I tried to do in this. I'm just going to read you one of those prose pieces. It's called Mallory's Poem. And I see a cat walking across Jeanette's screen. What a lovely image that was. Okay, this is in prose. Work party again at 6 a.m. Low-lying fog over the harbor as we board the ferry that takes us from Sham Shui Po to Kai Tak. Bitter cold, can see only the peak over Victoria now. No wonder money builds high up, a bridge against fire, flood, disease, the poor. I'm working alongside Dalil, who can barely raise his shovel, never mind singing in his perfect tenor voice. The poor devil has been down in sick bay for weeks with dysentery and electric feet. The gray skin is stretched over his bones like kite paper. I try to cover for him by working a little faster than usual, but I really can't keep up the pace. There must be 100 of us working on the reclamation, dumping earth from the high ground to extend the runway into the sea. You have to keep moving or freeze. Dummy, speedo. The guards are shouting to our left, trying to make better time. I suppose they get more rations if the work goes well and the few extra inches are gained each day. I fill Dalil's buckets as lightly as I can and help him up with them. He moves off ahead of me, so thin he looks as if he might crumble under the weight. The concentration required to put one foot ahead of the other must be enormous, but he plods towards the fabricated shoreline. He's not quite over the dysentery, and the backs of his legs are stained from the thin bile that passes through him. He resembles a mechanical scale, the two baskets suspended from the ends of a pole at slightly different levels at his sides. If we can make it to the edge without attracting attention, no one will notice the size of his load. We are only 20 yards from the water when one basket dips below knee level and brushes the ground. It's just enough to betray him. He falls straight forward on his face. The wicker baskets, unfortunately, remain upright and reproachful beside him. I stand at attention, my hands aching, my legs aching under the weight. Dalil does not move. I think his heart has given out. But then I can hear him whisper, "Je m'excuse, Album, je m'excuse." Two guards are kicking and shouting. They drag him onto his feet and knock him back and forth between them like a rag doll. One of them reaches into a half-filled basket and throws a handful of dirt into his face. The closed eyes seem to infuriate him as much as the baskets. "Dummy, cheat, no good." Dalil's bowels choose that moment to discharge, though he has eaten nothing for days. It's a miracle of creation or critical acumen. The guard's face contorts as he strikes Dalil in the mouth with his rifle butt. Then they are dragging him to the water's edge. All work on the reclamation has stopped. He is on his knees and has begun to sing one of those folk songs that followed us all the way from Sherbrooke to Newfoundland, across Canada, and aboard the Awatia to Hong Kong. I can feel my legs giving out and the bamboo pole cutting into my shoulder. The fog is breaking up and the sunlight reflects off the sword as it falls repeatedly on his neck. He remains somehow on his knees and has to be pushed over. One of them kicks his head down the small embankment into the sea. Several of us are detailed to dig a shallow grave, and he is buried headless beneath the runway of the Kai Tak airport. So that's part of the long poem called Hong Kong Poems, and it's the one that I had almost had a nervous breakdown. I'd been reading all of the books on the war, prisoner of war camps, and memoirs, and so on. And I felt I was suffering from something like secondary PTSD. So I went to my former wife Jan and said to her, Jan, I can't go on with this book. I have to let it go. I'm going to have a nervous breakdown. And she said, well, that's great news. You've been impossible to live with. So having said that and having had her blessing to abandon it, I was able to go up and write the rest of it, just giving myself that permission. And so it took me 9 years to do that. So when I said it's a bit scary when those disembodied voices grab your throat and ask for you to tell their story, it can take a lot of time and take a lot of stomach lining as well. So back to you, Jeanette, for a minute.
Sure. Well, I was going to remind our audience here that if they have any questions for you, Gary, that they are welcome to either submit them in the chat right now, or if they want to unmute themselves, they're welcome to ask that way. While we wait to see if there are any questions from the audience, I did want to ask you about the epigraph for this book, which is a quote from Margaret Atwood saying, I'm sure you can say it off by heart, but it says, "War is what happens when language fails." And I'm wondering, did you have that in your back pocket? Is that a quote that you've been carrying around? Did that come after you compiled the book? How did you? I mean, it feels perfect for this collection.
Yeah, it is perfect, and it's something that I discovered only recently, and something that she's written in response to current political situations. And it confirms what I've always thought, is that we need more diplomacy and less saber rattling. And it's not true that it's only language that causes war. It's human greed, political ambition, fear, all sorts of things cause war, but language is certainly central. When I was in Shadena Roan, and I was hoping to figure out what was happening. So I did a lot of research into the Somali campaign. That's when Black Hawk Down, the American film, was made as well about that whole story. And it occurred to me when I got there that if there had been more cultural sensitivity training going on in the Canadian Army, they'd have known that the Somalis were most noted being the nation of poets. They might have sent Michael Ondaatje and Margaret Atwood there instead of the Canadian Airborne Regiment. Would have had a better impact, I think. Anyway, that's part of my view on Margaret's quotation. I'm really glad I found it.
I also sorry about the cat. He's he wants to be a part of things. I also found the quote. This is in your the Terracotta Army in the lieutenant poem,
Yeah.
where you wrote, "Learn to write with this," he said, positioning my hands on the jade hilt of an ornate sword. "The enemy has not yet learned to read." I thought that those two lines sort of harkened back to that epigraph really perfectly.
Well, thanks for pointing
Mm.
that one out. Yeah, it's one of my favorite long poems, but it's hard to read one or two sections
Mm.
from that.
Mm.
When the book first came out, I used to have all those images on a PowerPoint, and I would read the poems along with the images, and it would have been nice to throw a few of those in tonight, but for the short time we had, I didn't think I could manage that.
Mhm. Well,
Now,
folks, last chance. Does anybody have a question out there? Oh, Georgia has a question. You're welcome to unmute, or you can type it to me in the chat.
No, I was wondering if Gary would spend a couple of minutes just simply talking about yourself, where you live, what you did, what you know, just like I would be interested in you, in learning about you.
well, happy to do that, Georgia. I'm a Vancouver boy. I was born here in 1940, and my mother died at age 35, and I was 7, and so we went to live in the prairies with my stepmother, and it was I was an emotional mess after the death of my mother, and I had wetting bed and rolling eyes, and it took me 2 years of living with this new family to heal again. And so then we moved back to the coast. My father tried farming and didn't like it. It was hailed out, frozen out, and then we moved out back to the coast where we fished commercially up in Rivers Inlet. And I worked at odd jobs. Our family was very poor. My father was the jack of all trades, very gifted, but also somewhat alcoholic. And so we were always living right on the edge. My mother worked at Toots Cafe at Broadway and Commercial for 50 cents an hour for a long time to supplement the monies that went into my father's alcohol issues. And so I managed to go to UBC and taught school up on Texada for a year with a totally incompetent teacher, but the students loved me and I loved them. And if you want to know how to learn something, give yourself the task of having to teach it. It's a very fast way to learn. So then I went to England and did a diploma in education and back to U of T for MA and PhD. And I always wanted to be a novelist, but every time I wrote prose, I got both feet in my mouth. I thought I needed the economy and discipline of poetry. And I found that I could do that. And so I never did write. I did write a book of short stories, but it was a little bit on the crummy side, I think. And so poetry has remained to be my choice. And currently, I taught at Concordia for 20 years in Montreal. I'm currently living with my wife, Anne Erickson, who is a novelist, at Thetis Island, between Vancouver Island and Chemainus. And Anne is doing all the work on climate change. She's just produced a book called Urgent Message from a Hot Planet, which is getting wonderful coverage out there. And it's for readers from 12 to 112. And so I've been reading all of those books. To answer Jeanette's question, no, I've read everything there is, almost everything there is to read about it. And so I realized that I don't need to write anything about it at the moment. Although the new collection of poems that's coming out from Guernica in the summer, the end of the summer, called The Oysters I Bring to Banquets, has a few poems in there that relate to the climate change, including one about J35, the killer whale that pushed her dead offspring all those days across the water. And I've written other poems about interspersed with my usual kinds of concerns. So that's a thumbnail sketch.
Thank you.
Okay.
And I'm enjoying the evening.
Well, good. Thank you. Thank you for coming.
Gary, since we only have a couple of minutes left, I'm wondering if you'd like to just mention where folks can find this book, aside from at Whistler Public Library after I return this copy.
Oh yeah, the first thing I want to say is that a new bookstore on Granville Island called Upstart and Crow has ordered copies. And they're a young, struggling couple with doing a heroic thing, starting a bookstore during the pandemic. And they have agreed to order books. You can also get them from Amazon.ca or write directly to the publisher at Rocks Mills Press. And you can find that online and all the information you need.
Wonderful. And of course, Whistler folks, Dan can bring them in at Armchair Books. He doesn't have any copies at the moment, but Gary gave us some good intel that if he orders before February 14th, he gets free shipping on the order. So if you're going to order through Dan, make sure you order before the 14th so you can get in on that order. Any final parting thoughts, Gary? Do you have something else you'd like to read us, or any words that you'd like to end with?
I'd love to read you one poem to end with.
Go ahead.
It's an elegy for my dear friend John Asfour, a Lebanese Canadian poet, whom I went to Palestine and Israel with after the signing of the Oslo Accords. And John, it was the first time I'd ever spent a lot of time with John as a blind person, but he saw more with his blindness than I saw with my sighted self. And I wanted to read this poem in memory of John and what happened to us in Jerusalem and elsewhere. It's called Elegy for John Asfour. Lebanon, a curious boy, a shiny object in the sand outside his village. With all the lights switched off and small metal particles removed from his eyes, his ruined optic nerves, he explodes into poetry. Words that have limped along, taking no responsibility for themselves, shape up and begin slowly to bear weight, acquire beauty, raise smiles, like the one that spreads across faces in East Jerusalem as children in the orphanage cling to his arms and legs. John bent over the oud, singing old familiar tunes in Arabic. As for the loss, he makes light of it. Laughter, his tonic of choice, of course, unless of course it is love, a concept dismissed as sentimental, but worn like a diminutive heart or cryptic hieroglyph on his sleeve. A joke or satirical comment about Israeli-Palestinian relations, beaming faces dappled by sunlight filtered through grapevines overhead. Obliged to talk politics, Bedouins displaced again in the Negev, Saib Erekat, a walk near Abraham's well. Propped up in palliative care and flirting with the duty nurse, he winces as the needle releases a surge of morphine into his vein. The new drug promised reprieve, shrunk the tumor in his lung to half its size, then stopped, outflanked by fully armed sleeper cells. The dark archive of his poems never raises the question why. The flight of birds, the line of golden wheat against the blue of sky.
That's beautiful. Thank you, Gary. Well, my friends, we've reached 8 o'clock. And so that is where we're going to say goodnight. Thanks to everybody who joined us this evening. Thank you, Gary, for your insights and for your beautiful readings. Anything else we need to cover before we say goodbye tonight? You're doing a little bit of a tour, right? Or is this the last stop, so to speak?
No, when George Eliot Clark, a wonderful poet and former parliamentary poet, found out about my book, he phoned me and said, let's do some gigs together, because my book Canticles 1 and 2 covers some similar ground. So we've done that for the Eden Mills Festival. We did a Zoom for the Canadian Foreign Policy Institute. And we have coming up on the 24th of February, the same kind of quote unquote dynamic duo
Mhm.
for a US organization called World Beyond War.
Mm.
So people who are interested could plug into that and hear George as well. He's a fabulous poet.
Wonderful. Well, Gary, I hope we can host you in person the next time that you are promoting a book. This was really wonderful, but just being in person would have been even better. But thank you so much for joining us on Zoom tonight. Thank you to everybody who attended, and we are going to end our recording there.
Thank you
Good night.
all. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much.
Yeah,
It was a
thanks,
great
Gary.
evening.